Today's class, quick overview. I'm going to cover economic fundamentals because I believe that it's the economy that drives real estate, and look at the key drivers, performance, and something I call economic base analysis that you should all know and understand well. Then we'll move on to the real estate physical cycle. I really believe that there are two parts to the real estate cycle, and this is what I'm best known for. And it's really demand for real estate, supply for real estate that drives occupancies, which is just the inverse of vacancy rates, and rents. And we'll see that shortly. And then the real estate financial cycle, which is based on interest rates, capital flows to real estate, buyers, and that really drive the pricing of real estate, and cap rates, which is how we really look at and compare and build on real estate. So one of the things that happened is when I got my PhD in real estate, I used to say, people say, what do you do? And I said, well, I teach real estate. And they said, oh, you teach people how to sell houses. And I go, no. I work in commercial real estate. But really the best way to describe real estate is to break it into two categories. One is home ownership. And if you want to invest in real estate home ownership, which would be houses, townhomes, condominiums, the only way to invest in that is to invest in the production process, basically in land developers or in home builders, or potentially do that yourself. So it's like a production process, just like cars. As a home builder myself, many years ago, you take and buy some raw land, you develop it and get it prepped, put in what we call the horizontal infrastructure. So the roads, the water, the sewer, telecom, et cetera. And then in many cases you have, and I know that there are plenty of family offices that go through this development process. And then you sell finished lots to home builders, and most of the large home builders in the United States, US Homes, Pulte, are names that are kind of known around the country here in the United States. They'll come in and they'll take down, 50 or 100 lots in a subdivision to build houses on, and that's obviously the vertical construction. Some people do all of it, but it's really two. There's really kind of two parts there, and two sets of expertise to do those two different things. What I really am focusing on in this class is in this 2-hour class is really. And I use the term income producing real estate instead of commercial, because when we think of income, you're leaving out one of the major property types, which are apartments. Okay. Many people say, well, that's residential. And notice that I didn't use the term residential above, because you say, oh, apartments. Well, apartments are really part of the income producing real estate category, not the home ownership category. And as you all know, one of the new hot types today is actually taking and having single family homes for rent. We now have many funds out there that are doing this, as well as a few publicly traded REITs that do it. So that's an investment process. Stay there for a second, DJ, where you either develop a property from scratch, and I teach a full class on that, or you acquire existing properties, and we'll go into more detail with that. Okay. And then you own and operate those on a go-forward basis, and it's really an ongoing business. Every property, every office building, every retail center, every apartment building is its own standalone business with competitors, the apartment building across the street, with clients, the tenants who are renting from you. And so that ongoing overall process of owning and operating real estate is one of the things that, we have a number of courses on at the University of Denver that help people do in both our undergraduate and graduate programs. So now, next slide, DJ. So in institutional real estate, and probably really beginning in family office real estate too many years ago, there are really 5 major property types or food groups. And they are office, industrial, retail, apartments, and hotels. And the institutions, once they started investing, said, hey, we need a way to be able to look over and benchmark, if you will, how our investments are doing. Just like when you invest in the stock market, you're benchmarking yourself against the S&P 500 or the Russell 2000 or whatever your strategy is. And so the institutional investors and their advisors got together and formed a group called NCREIF, which is the National Council of Real Estate Investment Fiduciaries, kind of a long-winded name. And in 1978, they said, let's form an index. And if you're a member of NCREIF, you put your information into the index, and then you can see what's happening. Now, one of the things that they did was everybody said, well, I don't want to give my individual information out for other people to see because that might harm my competitive advantage. So when information is put into NCREIF, the information is proprietary or private to NCREIF. They bring it all together and give you an overall index number for the whole thing by property type. And you could look at and say, okay, I'd like to know how office is performing in Chicago, as an example. And the masking criteria requires that you have at least 4 properties owned by at least 2 different managers, so that I can't pick out, and try and figure out how, for instance, Prudential that owns 3 buildings there, how Prudential is doing versus my building. It's got masking criteria so that the privacy of each individual building is held in 100% confidence. One of our goals at the Institute now is to start a family office real estate property index, because family offices do things somewhat differently than we see happening in the institutional world. And so in this graph, what you see is that we've got the historic returns, and NCREIF started again in 1978. So the index is now 40 years old. So that's a good long time frame. And there's something interesting here. And what you see is the average return over that time frame, and then the standard deviation or the variation of that return. And just to kind of from your statistics course back in high school or college, to kind of remember what standard deviation means, it means that it's a bell-shaped curve, and it says that in one standard deviation is occurrences that happen at least 68% of the time, or in the main portion of the bell curve, and that's either plus or minus. So if you will, if we look at retail, it basically says that the average return was 9.5%. And if you look down to the bottom, the standard deviation was 7. That means in any given year, you might get 9.5 plus 7, or 16.5% return, or you might get 9.5 minus 7, or a 2.5% return. Okay. So in general terms, any year you'd expect this, bouncing back and forth to the highs and lows or something in between, but the average comes out to 9.5%. So as standard deviations get higher, obviously the risk gets higher. And if we look at hotel, we see that, the average return there is 8.2, but the standard deviation is a little over 11. So that means in any given year, you might get 8 plus 11, which would be a 19.2% return, or 8.2 minus 11, or basically almost a negative 3% rate of return. And if you will, it's the one that and office are the only 2 property types that have had, within one standard deviation, a negative return year. The unique thing about this is that the normal way that we would look at investments is that if I'm going to take more risk, if I'm going to have more of a standard deviation, I should expect a higher return. But if you drew kind of a curved line through these numbers, basically through retail, industrial, office, and hotel, it's actually running in the opposite direction, which is quite unique. Normally, you would assume that hotel might have the highest return and the highest standard deviation. But actually here we've got the highest return with the lowest standard deviation. And many of you are probably thinking, wait a minute, retail has had historically the highest return and the lowest standard deviation. But now you have to look at the composition of what it is made up here. And what we have is institutional investors who, over the last 40 years, were looking for the highest quality retail. And the two major sub-property types within retail have been regional malls, which have done well pre-COVID, and grocery anchored neighborhood and community centers. When I was at Alex. Brown and then Jones Lang LaSalle, we focused on two property types. Grocery anchored retail centers and industrial warehouse were our two specialties. And we had as our largest client, CalPERS, California Public Employees Retirement System, which is the largest public pension plan in the United States, with about $390 billion worth of investments, of which they today have a 12% allocation to real estate, or about $30 to $40 billion invested in real estate. They also had 5 or 6 different advisors, not just us. So kind of unique to see this. So we call these the main basic property types that institutional investors invested in. And that has now kind of morphed or expanded over the last couple of years. If you go to the next slide, DJ, we will see that we now have added a lot of specialized sub-property types. If we looked at publicly traded REITs, real estate investment trusts, and we're planning a class on analyzing all those separately, what you would find is that about 20 years ago, they started to have companies that specialized in different things. The pension funds and endowments, the institutional investors, really didn't start to get into these specialized property types till about a decade to 15 years ago. And if you will, I've kind of grouped them as, I'm going to call them subcategories. So you have office buildings, but now we've got specialized medical office buildings. We also have parking garages. Normally you'd think of them as being part of an office building. Many times they're attached separately. And today, many investors break those off because they have their own, their own income stream and their own risks to them, different ways of managing them, et cetera. And we have, publicly traded companies that have gone into parking garages and that kind of thing. In the industrial sector, many warehouse or self-storage facilities have become extremely strong and popular over the last number of years. And at one of the NACREIF webinars that I listened to just 2 weeks ago, one of the other large pension fund advisors in the country, Heitman Group, their chief real estate investment strategist said that they had done a study on self-storage facilities and realized that they actually had such stable income characteristics that they looked as good or better than office buildings. And so they have decided that it is its own, separate property type with institutional quality income coming into it. And obviously manufacturing facilities would be something else. However, most investors have stayed away from those over time because if you had, for instance, a auto manufacturing plant, its design is pretty unique. And if General Motors decides to move out of a plant, its reuse is rather difficult. All the equipment that's been bolted to the floors and everything else, the design and layout, very different from a warehouse. So institutional investors have stayed with kind of bulk warehouse and R&D flex which are smaller spaces that I'm sure many of you have been into, where you've got a little either storefront or office in the front with with a regular door to walk in and possibly a glass window. And then the backside is storage space with a truck-sized dock door to get materials in and out of. There are many companies that do manufacturing in a normal warehouse space. In bulk warehouse, what we want is a lot of dock doors, and you've seen that where they've got 20, 30 trucks all backed up to a warehouse space. And inside of warehouses, the new higher technology design today in warehouses is that you have cross docking, so you have dock doors on each side. And a truck pulls in from the manufacturer. That's a full truckload of some product. It gets brought into the warehouse and put into the storage racks. And then out of the other side, you have smaller trucks that are taking less than truckloads that are sending them out to retail sites, or actually today delivering them to customers within a geographic area. And so that flow through has become very important. And, just a quick thing, I did research on this way back in the mid 90s. The key thing to look for if you were going to invest in a warehouse is the ceiling height, or what we call the clear height. How high can I stack things in a warehouse? And industrial racking systems come in 8-foot increments. So warehouses that are 8, 16, 24, 32 or 40 feet high make sense. If I have a 22-foot high warehouse, I have lost, some ceiling height there for the next racking system. And so it's cubic feet in a warehouse, not square feet of floor space. That's important. And today, the new high-tech buildings have our 40-foot heights, so they can stack five high in their racking systems. The floors in those warehouses have to have laser leveling when they pour the concrete, so that they're very flat, because when you're driving a forklift around with something 36 feet in the air, you can't have it wobbling. Wire guided systems so that the forklift driver doesn't run into something, et cetera. So it's become a really high tech thing. And the company that I work with, Black Creek Group, we've done 4 industrial funds over time, and picking the right markets and everything else is something that we'll get into at a later time. In the apartment area, obviously you've got seniors housing as a sub property type. And this isn't just age restricted in the seniors housing category. We have independent living facilities, where it's like a hotel. You get meals, transportation, housekeeping, assisted living, where you need help with activities of daily living, bathing, dressing, toilet use, that kind of thing. And then skilled nursing, where you need medical professionals to administer medications and do other things. Student housing has been the hot new topic and property type literally over the last decade. As we've had the next boom of the millennial generation coming to colleges and that kind of thing, and most universities not being in the position to add a lot of additional dorm rooms and that kind of thing, and students wanting something nicer than just a dorm room. So those have become extremely popular. Manufactured home communities, or the old term is mobile home parks, where you develop the horizontal infrastructure, water, sewer, electrical, et cetera, and people bring in their own mobile home to put on the site and pay you rent for that. And then obviously the most recent and hottest thing going right now are single family for rent houses. And during the Great Recession, we had a lot of foreclosures, and a number of institutional investors started funds to buy those. The original strategy was, we're going to buy them, rent them out until the housing market comes back. When prices are back up, we'll sell them, take the big profit, and move on. But they worked on the efficiencies of managing 500 homes and their roofs and their HVAC systems and plumbing, et cetera. And now it's become a very, very strong, sub property type within the for rent housing. And then, of course, the retail.
I have a question for you. When you talk about multifamily and, with one of the main property types, are you also including senior apartments, which might be 55 and older, workforce housing, or is it strictly market rate apartment?
No, those would be, those have always been, I guess, good question, DJ. Those have always been part of the rental, apartment rental categories. And I guess, yes, I should probably put those in here as subcategories, but 55 and older seniors restrictions are popular. Workforce housing is extremely popular in demand, and you are guaranteed that if you build it, you will fill it to 100%. The problem is that you're basically getting below market rate rents, and for that, you end up having to typically partner with local communities and governments to help you with. Typically, it's low interest rate financing that allows that to be economically feasible. There's also something called LIHTC, which is low income housing, where large companies, or for that matter, wealthy families, have an opportunity to come in and make an investment into LIHTC housing and get a bunch of tax credits to use against other income that you have, and bind those LIHTC loans, et cetera, at a very low rate, is something that many wealthy families actually end up doing. Have one of our DU alum doing that kind of property type that I have into my development class to talk about how that goes. And the developer of those properties gets paid a fee that comes out over the first 10 years of the property being there. So it's a low risk but highly complicated process to get selected for it and stuff like that. So great question, DJ. Thank you.
Yeah. So just so I'm clear, so that when you're doing your market cycle analysis, or you're discussing multifamily, you are including those other property or other apartment types?
It would include the 55 and over, the workforce housing, rental properties. I believe, yes, are part of that, but they basically help keep the occupancy levels high because they're lower cost. And you qualify based on, you have to have an income that's 60% of the average median in your location and that kind of thing. So, but as a subgroup of it, they are included in the occupancy levels. But the asking rents are obviously lower there. So, okay, not as much profit potential in those.
And RV parks, are they part of the manufactured communities? Because sometimes they can be more hospitality than housing.
So the manufactured home communities are, in most cases, just where you have a mobile home or a manufactured home that's put on site, and you literally tie it down and it's not going to move. An RV park, and there are a couple of REITs that do these. They would fit into the hotel category because it's short term. People stay for 1 or 2 weeks, or possibly a month in some cases. But that's more of a hospitality type of property. Okay, but that is a sub property type that some people have invested in. But with hotels, you literally have to have an operator on site all the time. And with hotels, and I'll just jump to it at the moment. In hotels today, you have to have what we call a flag. So, a Hilton, a Hyatt, lower level, Best Western, that kind of thing, who is operating the hotel for you. And the key is that they have reservation systems where they get people to come in. There are a lot of now niche hotel operators with specialty things. And as a matter of fact, I think the Marriott Corporation is up to, I believe now we're at like 14. There are actually 14 sub property types, from luxury to upper scale to business to upper upscale to budget to highway. There's so many different target markets in the hotel business. It's quite unique. And at the moment, business hotels are what's hurting. All of their resort and weekend stay and resort vacation hotel properties are literally full for the summer now that COVID restrictions have been lifted. And you probably heard that Airbnb and VRBO, where you rent your house or your condo, are saying that they've got 3 million current members, and they need another million more. They need another 25% because of all the demand for people wanting to be out and going. So hotels literally crashed and closed, and now they are bouncing back in a big way. So it's, again, the most volatile of the property types because of the fact that the rents are one night at a time. Okay. So then the last
Glenn,
category.
Yeah,
Yes.
Glenn, one more question too, based upon what Roberto asked. How is the performance of the mobile home parks? Are you aware how they perform? Because it is
Yep.
short term.
Yep. I've got a good friend who's a DU alum that specializes in finding and purchasing mobile home parks for bigger investors who own a number of them. And they typically perform very well because once a mobile home has been set in place, it's very expensive to take it away and move it someplace else. So the long term.
I'm sorry. I meant not mobile homes, but I meant like the short term rentals.
Oh, RV parks.
RV parks. I'm sorry. Yes.
Right. Well, the RV parks were shut down just like other hotels were. And right now, my understanding is that they are all booked out 100%. One of my sons, who was planning a travel vacation this summer to do some camping, et cetera, has called and looked at, sites basically all over the country. And most of them are fully booked for the summer, but obviously they were closed last year altogether. So they really have hotel type characteristics to them from that standpoint. So any other questions there? Okay, so let's move on to and retail. Obviously, restaurants, a sub property type, hit very hard with COVID. Marinas and marina-based communities. One of my students just did a redevelopment project on a marina that had interior boat storage. They're tearing down the boat storage facility and putting up a high-rise apartment building on that pad. And in Florida, and the idea is you got wealthy people that want to be right near their boats, and so all the marina slips will be going with the new apartments that are going in. And even though they're just in the development phase, they've already got interest and people saying, "I want one," when it's finished. Golf courses and golf course-based communities. Yep, you can buy the land and lease it out to an operator, just like a hotel would be. We've also got cell towers, wind farms. I got two former students that literally they're basically acquisition people out looking to find sites that are close to large electric power distribution grids, and buy enough land to be able to put it in, because the transmission line to the power grid is one of the secondary expense after land and putting in the solar panels. And so both wind farms and solar farms are now available as as site. And if you will, we could call those infrastructure. And that's one of the new hot topics that we're seeing in the institutional world is infrastructure funds getting started. And it could be toll roads, toll bridges, cell towers, wind farms, water and sewer lines. Cities are running out of money, and if they can sell it off and then have its income, go to the investor, that's happening. And many years ago, people got into timber. You go, wait a minute, timber? How do you rent that? And the answer is you literally grow the trees, and you lease the land to a lumber mill who comes in and pays you a base rent for renting the land and a percentage rent, just like you would in a mall for sales. So the amount of lumber board feet they take off, they pay you a percentage rent of that. So if the trees are growing fast, you're making more money. So southern land where trees grow year round is much more in demand than northern where things grow slower. And then farmland. You've got a lot of farmers who retire, and what do? You may have heard, or I just heard actually 3 weeks ago, that Bill Gates Foundation is now the largest owner of farmland in the United States with, I believe it's like 500 million acres of land in the US. And their plan with that is to grow more organic crops. And change the world's food supply based on what they're trying to do. So there are many, many institutional investors, and there is both a NCREIF farmland index and a NCREIF timberland index out there. So we got just a lot more things to look at than we used to in just the 5 major property types, all these subspecialties out there. Next slide. So when you're going to invest in real estate, you got to determine how much risk you're willing to accept. And if you will, there's a development cycle in real estate and kind of understanding those risks. So, the highest risk is just buying a piece of raw land and going to get it what we call entitled or zoned properly. Hey, I bought this piece of farmland and I want to annex it into, a city, and so that I can get city services of fire, police. I'm going to have to put in and connect into the sewer system and the water system, bring power out to it and telecom out to it, stuff like that. So there is a major, what we call entitlement risk in developing land. The city may go, no, that's not what we want there. Our plan is that would be industrial land, not residential land. As you know, around airports, people complain about the noise of planes landing. And the 30 years ago now, the city of Denver took the old airport and moved it out of town by 20 miles. And people thought it was out in the middle of nowhere. But it's no farther away from downtown Denver than Chicago O'Hare is from downtown Chicago. And when they did it, they put in flight path restrictions and, whether people could build or not, because it was all completely just ranch land out there. And of course, some developers got some land cheap and knew that it was in a flight path zone. And now we're getting a few neighborhoods complaining about that. And they're coming back and saying, it's in the law, it's in, it was in the deed that you got, et cetera. If you're not smart enough to look at it, it's your problem. So interesting to see that kind of thing happen. And then actually going through the development process of the land, you never know what you might come across when you when you start developing. And again, live examples that make a big difference. Out in southeast Denver, a developer bought a piece of land, connected into the main sewer line that was only at the main road that this land abutted, built 150 homes. All was great. Another developer bought a piece of land next door, expecting to do the exact same thing, only to find out that the main sewer line was at full capacity, and hence they had to put in a 4-mile sewer line, which was multi-millions of dollars to be able to bring sewer into that site. So, the profit they were expecting went to close to zero because they hadn't scoped out and checked out all of the details that are there. So having someone that knows local things, having your architects, engineers, and everybody else make sure that you have everything you need is one of the big risks in development. And then, of course, construction today. Construction is also, somewhat of a risky business. And the most recent risks since COVID started were material shortages that have gone to material prices going up substantially. Just heard of one of the national home builders that built starter homes. Originally, their lumber packages were $16,000 for the wood for the home, and at the peak, which has now started to back off a little bit here just a few months ago, that lumber package went to $46,000 or triple. So, when you're talking $100,000 to $150,000 home and adding $32,000 to your lumber package, that was basically their profit right there. And labor costs going through the roof as well. And people just being so busy with everybody home at COVID, they decided to do projects at home. And so the demand for labor to come and do things very high. And I did a remodel on my summer home. And when I called people, it was either, well, we're 9 months out, or yeah, we can come next week, but our price is double or triple what we would normally charge to do it if you want us right now. Redevelopment of a property. I've got an existing property that I want to potentially change its use. Right now, we're seeing in downtowns some office buildings being converted to apartments. We're seeing a lot of retail being converted into other things over the past years, retail getting converted into office. Many malls are now actually saying we got enough space and enough parking here that's not being used. Let's put some apartments in here. One of my students did a project for his family in Arkansas, and they owned kind of a third tier mall near the downtown, and the Sears went out of business. They literally ripped the center roof out of the Sears. On one side, they put in some experience retail, a movie theater, a couple of restaurants, et cetera. And on the other side, they went up 4 stories and put apartments above with parking on the first floor. So we're seeing a lot of, right now, probably the best opportunities are to find some distressed retail at a good price and redevelop it into something else that makes sense. And so a feasibility study, which is one of the courses I teach, helps you, get to what is the highest and best use for that property today, which changes over time. Next one is, an existing building that needs lease up. You may have had a major tenant leave. And if you have an individual owner who doesn't have the money, for instance, an office to spend on putting in the new tenant improvements, today we're leasing office space at, let's call it $40 a square foot in many of the major cities or second tier cities like Denver. And tenants expect that you'll come in and rehab the place, and you're going to give them $40 a square foot in tenant improvement costs. Plus, you're going to give them a year of free rent on a 10-year lease. So in the first year, the actual cash flow on that space is negative $40, followed by 9 years of positive $40 rent coming in. So people with more resources and cash flow are able to do that to make put that together. I remember Sam Zell, when he started Equity Office, he said, I'm buying properties from individuals that can't afford to, do the releasing on it, whereas I've got deep pockets and cash flow to be able to do that. So I'm buying buildings at good prices and turning them into higher quality buildings by rehabbing the lobby, getting higher quality tenants in where I can afford to, put up the cash for their tenant improvements. And then last but not least, existing operating buildings that are fully stabilized, that have lease long lease terms left on them. I know many family office entrepreneurs, former students that I've had with family offices, who will buy a property, an existing property, get it re-tenanted, get it up and stabilized with higher quality credit tenants, et cetera, and then turn around and sell that as a core property to one of the big pension funds or endowments as a, it's like it's a Class A property with bond-like income to it. So you're buying you're buying the top quality property that's already stabilized. So it's more bond-like income to it. The amount of leverage changes as to the investor. Typically, pension funds and endowments, they've got cash coming in every month as money comes in from the employees who they're going to fund their retirement of. So money comes in every month, so they've got a lot of cash coming in, and they may buy buildings with no loans on them at all or very low leverage. Because if they got $100 million they have to put out and they can buy one building, they're all set. If they buy it with a 50% loan, now they got to find and buy two buildings in it. But remember that leverage amplifies the upside. So if I'm today buying a building at a 5% cap rate, cash on cash return, and I can get a 3% loan, and I get a 50% loan, that extra 2% goes to the equity. So the equity return becomes 7% instead of 5%. But it also accelerates the downside. If a cash flow on a building drops off and you can't pay the loan, you've got the risk of foreclosure on the loan. So basically that rate of return or the cap rate overall on the property has to be greater than the mortgage interest rate. And that's kind of the key. Next slide. So, back in 1990, I went to work for Prudential Real Estate Investors, and we were going through a recession in 1990. And they said, Glenn, figure out what happened, why it happened, whether we can kind of monitor it, see it coming next time, and figure out how to control for it, invest around it, et cetera. And so in my research, what I found was that there are really three key drivers to demand for real estate. The first one is the little green there on the top, population growth. 2020 census says that we have 330 million people in the United States today, and that we're forecast to grow at 0.7%. Do the math on that, and that's about 3 million people a year additional in the United States. And let me just put that into simple real estate terms for you. 3 million additional people means we need to build a complete city the size of Denver, Colorado, because Denver, and that's actually Denver's population just hit 3 million people. We need to give them a place to eat, sleep, shop, work, play, pray, store stuff in. And so we need space to do that with. Okay. Next one is GDP growth, and GDP, gross domestic product, is just the output of the country, just kind of like the sales or gross revenues of a company. And you can see here the Great Recession, as we call it, in 2008 and 9, where GDP went to negative almost 3% and then bounced back. From 2010 through 2019, you can see that we bounced around at just a little over 2% GDP growth during that time frame. The GDP dropped to almost a negative 4% with COVID recession, but bounced back and has literally come back even stronger. We've had 4 to 5% quarterly now GDP growth as things come back online, because as opposed to a normal recession driven by a lack of demand, it was a forced shutdown of demand. And so we're seeing a real strong bounce back that moderates out through kind of 2022 and kind of back to, if you look at that number there, ever so slightly lower than the previous 10-year expansionary period, which is the forecast there. And you go, where do you get a 10-year forecast? And the answer is the Congressional Budget Office has a number of economists. They survey other economists, and that is the 10-year forecast coming out of the Congressional Budget Office. But really the number one and key thing to look at is employment growth, because every time someone's employed, they got to work someplace. And even if they're working at home, they are then on a computer, and you need a server hotel that is, handling their internet activity and storage goods and all that kind of stuff. So you can see the two recessions with employment going negative during the Great Recession and the COVID recession. You see that employment growth averaged right around 2% over the past 10 decades and is expected to be a little lower than that, more like 1% over the next decade. But that's part of the math, if you will, of the Census Bureau that says that the baby boom generation, those people born from people coming back from World War II, like me, are going to retire at today's age of Social Security of 66. And after 2026, more baby boomers are retiring than millennials coming out of school going into the job force. Of course, the question is, do we really actually fully retire, or do we end up doing something else? Most of the people I know that have retired within a year, they're going a little stir crazy, so they've got a job doing something. From all the way from greeting at Walmart or driving a shuttle bus at the airport to being a consultant for the companies that they used to work for. I have a number of friends who retired, and their companies called them and said, "We need you back. How many hours can you give us, et cetera." So whether we actually have the employment growth drop off that much will be interesting to see. So those are the demand drivers. Next slide. We look at the two things that you should be careful on costs. So
Glenn, I've got a question for you. So in that example, you said we've got 3 million people, which is equivalent to a city of Denver. Are you able to go down to a micro level and say, okay, the growth in population growth, for example, is 0.5% in
Steve Gold
in Denver. So can you sort of take that $3 million and identify it where that would end up landing from a projection perspective based upon localities?
Oh, yes. And as a matter of fact, when I teach development and feasibility class, we start with exactly what you see here, kind of a U.S. and we kind of call it the funnel. We start with what's happening with the U.S. Then we go to the city, or really the metro area, and say what's happening in Denver. And Denver, as a great example, has been growing so that the U.S. has been growing at 0.7% or 0.8% historically, actually, for the last decade. Denver was growing at 1.2%, which is 30% higher than the U.S. average. So it's gathering more people. And we're actually going to get into that here in another step, DJ. So that's a great question that, and one of the things that any teacher loves is that, you're catching the logic flow and you're asking the question, and then I'm going to answer in a slide that's coming up very, very quickly here. Yes. So we're going to start pinpointing and looking at different metro areas to target for investment. So great question. And we'll get there in just a minute. Okay. So the other side, of course, is costs. And so we look at inflation. So the consumer price index, you can see historically has been running just around the 2% level over the last 15 years, actually. And you can see it drop down during the Great Recession. It also went to 0 in 2015, which is kind of unique, but it didn't really drop off during COVID. And the forecast is that it's probably going to run a little higher at more like 2.5% over the next decade. Now, the consumer price index is basically a basket of goods that consumers use all the time. So food, gas, other things like that. Obviously in here is not, construction materials at this point, which would show up to be much, much higher over the past year. And then interest rates. And the key variable we look at here is the 10-year U.S. 10-year Treasury. And I'm sorry that the title isn't on this page. But U.S. 10-year Treasuries are the benchmark risk-free rate. In other words, if you want to buy something where you're guaranteed you're not going to lose money, the international standard is the U.S. Treasuries. And of course, you can get short-term 3-month Treasuries 1 year, but the 10-year is what we use in real estate, in commercial income-producing real estate, because unlike single-family homes where you can get a 30-year mortgage, the maximum time frame you're going to see in commercial real estate is a 10-year loan, because people don't want to take interest rate risks out past that. With apartments, you've got the government agencies, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and Ginnie Mae, who make home loans. They also make apartment loans. So there you can see up to 15 years. But looking at the 10-year Treasury is the benchmark risk-free rate that every real estate investor should be watching at all times. As a matter of fact, I've got a daily feed that just shows me what's happening. And yesterday, the 10-year Treasury closed at 1.58%. You can see here that, and I'll have another slide on it shortly too, that in 2005, the 10-year Treasury was at 5%. During COVID, as a matter of fact, in May of last year, the 10-year Treasury hit 0.6%, the lowest interest rate we've ever seen in recorded history. Okay. And it's literally over the last decade, since the Great Recession up to COVID, had been running at an average rate there, you can see, of around 2%, bouncing from kind of 1.5 to 3 during that time frame. And the forecast is that it should kind of come back to its long-term average of 3% over the next decade. However, I will tell you that over the last decade, since 2010, every year that forecast looks basically the same. Every economist says, well, it's got to revert to the long-term average. And it hasn't. It's stayed lower than that. So one of the things that I hear a lot of economists talk about is that we're in a lower for longer time frame. The world is awash in a lot of cash. And so investors are looking to make investments where they can get a yield. And, the safe yield right now is a 10-year Treasury at 1.6%. And every time it's risk on, everybody goes to the stock market. When it's risk off, they all run to 10-year Treasuries. And internationally, we have a lot of 10-year Treasuries being purchased by international investors. And China was actually, over the last decade, the largest purchaser of U.S. 10-year Treasuries. So thinking about that, that's why we have interest rates that are so low. You can get a home loan today for around 2%, and you can get commercial loans around 3% with 7 to 10 year timeframes on them, which is pretty incredible. So I believe that we're going to be in this low interest rate environment going forward for the next decade. In addition, with the U.S. government out there, spending more and more money, having these $1 trillion relief packages and economic stimulus packages and infrastructure, et cetera, it is highly likely that they will work to keep interest rates low, because that keeps their budget low. So as a matter of fact, I'm going to hold on that and get to it in a second, because I got another slide to show you here. So go to the next slide. So you asked about individual cities and what they do and how they grow differently than the U.S. average. And the answer is that what you have to do is look at the economic base industry that drives a city. And sometimes there's more than one. But basically, an economic base industry exports a good or service outside of the local economy. That brings money into the local economy, causing growth. And for every economic base employee, there are then 2 local service employees that also work and support the economic base industry workers and everybody else. And by example, the simplest example everybody would know is Detroit, Michigan's economic base industry is the auto industry, right? So if auto industry is doing well and growing, hiring more people, Detroit's going to grow. Auto industry drops off, Detroit drops off with it. Okay. So economic
is that the same thing for like Amazon or a tech company?
Okay.
Could you consider that
right? We'll get
exporting.
Right. Well, it'll be on the next slide. Great question. Okay. So, but economic based employers drive the health and growth of each city. So now flip to the next slide. And you will see that what I've done is, so the US government collects data, employment data, which is, by the way, the most accurate data that the US government has, because every time you hire an employee, day one, first day, what do? They fill out a W-2. On that W-2, it says, what industry is your company? And every company has a 5-digit code. That's the NAICS, the North American Industrial Classification Code. So here, what I've done is I've taken all the codes, okay, the first 2 digits of a 5-digit code, and said it's government. And so that's federal government. If I went from the first number 9, which is government, and I went out 3 steps, it would tell me whether it's federal or state or local, right? Because I can go 9-0, 9-1, 9-2, 9-3, et cetera. So government is the largest employer sector in our country. And it's 16% of all employment. And obviously Washington, DC is its economic base is the federal government. Okay. So, and Washington, DC, by the way, has been the most stable real estate market over the last 40 years because the federal government never shrinks. It always grows. Okay. And then all those companies that consult to the federal government, all of the people that are there lobbying, et cetera, they all grow with the government as well. The next one, professional science and tech services, which, by the way, wasn't even a category 30 years ago, is technology driven. And that's now almost 15% of our economy. And San Jose or Silicon Valley is a good example of that. Okay. Austin, Texas would be another good example of that. Okay. Healthcare uniquely is typically not a economic based industry because hospitals only take care of local people that live there, except in 5 categories. And the highest concentration is Rochester, Minnesota, where the Mayo Clinic is. And they do a lot of, research and, people fly in there for things. So as a matter of fact, there are 5. There is Rochester, Minnesota, the Mayo Clinic. There is the Cleveland Clinic, and each of these has some specialty. So Cleveland Clinic, as an example, is the best in the world for heart. And they actually, people fly in from all over the world to do that. They actually have a 5-star hotel right next to the Cleveland Clinic. And when people from Europe and Asia and the Middle East fly in, many times they bring family members with them. They stay in the 5-star hotel while the heart surgery is being done. If you have cancer, you want to go to the best in the world, you're going to go to the Anderson Clinic in Houston. It is number 1 in the world for that. If you want to go for other things, Boston with Harvard Medical is strong, and then actually where I used to teach at Johns Hopkins, number 1 in the world for eye. It has the Wilmer Eye Institute as an example. So there's really 5 cities where healthcare is actually an economic-based industry where they're bringing money in from outside of the local area. Retail trade. Notice that I don't have any city there. Typically only supplies the local people coming into stores, et cetera. Accommodation and food service, obviously Las Vegas, number 1. You can think of others. Manufacturing would be Detroit. Financial activities, obviously New York. Chicago also is a financial activity because of the agricultural trade board being there, et cetera. Construction, you'd think, well, wait a minute, you're only building for local people in construction. How could construction be an economic-based industry? How does it bring money in from other cities? And the answer is when you have retirement community or a resort community where people have second homes, construction becomes an economic base industry. So, for instance, in Florida, construction makes up close to 10% of all employment, whereas on average across the United States, it's only 5%. Okay. Wholesale trade, in other words, stuff moving around from warehouse out to the retailers, et cetera. Chicago being the center of the United States. And believe it or not, Chicago is the largest trucking and warehouse market in the country. It's also a port because it's right on the Great Lakes. Okay. Transportation and warehousing, obviously, again, Chicago. And as a matter of fact, Cleveland, Ohio is a manufacturing city, whereas Columbus, Ohio is a warehousing city. So, they're not that far apart, but they have different economic based industries. Education, any state college town. So pick it, Madison, Wisconsin, State College, Pennsylvania, Gainesville, Florida, where the main state university is. It's typically the largest employer in that city, and it drives growth. So if you get more students, the city's growing. Information management. I'll throw out one here. Richmond, Virginia. I didn't put it down. CoStar, the company that collects commercial real estate data, around the country and now going international. They moved their headquarters from DC down to Richmond, Virginia, and hired 750 people. Okay. Arts, entertainment, and recreation. Obviously, the entertainment would be Vegas. Recreation would be a lot of towns in Colorado, Aspen, Breckenridge, that kind of thing. Managements of companies and enterprises, typically, you're managing a manufacturing company or whatever. And then finally, the mining category, which is everything, coal, oil, gas, et cetera. Houston, Texas has been that. Dallas used to be, but it's diversified away. It's actually now got tech, it's got manufacturing and other things. So it's no longer the only dominant economic base industry. And notice that that's only 1/2 of 1% of all of those. So any city you're going to invest in, you should know the main economic base industry in there. And then you should also know the main economic based companies that are there. And in many cases, the local newspapers, et cetera, or even the local TV stations will go, hey, our biggest employers are, in Minnesota, it's, 3M. Okay. That's a manufacturing company. And they're the biggest employer in the Minneapolis, St. Paul Twin Cities. And so how 3M's doing, is going to tell us how the city is doing. So very important to know what's going to drive growth in your city. And as we get to portfolio analysis on the 4th day, the last class I teach, we'll actually be looking at the risks of some family office portfolios based on the cities that they've invested in. That'll be one of our first risk categories to take a look at. And we're also doing research on, have economic based industries driven growth faster? Can we pick future cities for their growth based on their economic based industries? Because we can certainly look at that in the past.
Glenn, I have
I have a question here. Is military is under a government, or is it a separate?
Military is a subcategory of government. So you can actually get to the 3rd NAICS code number and look at it. So yes, a city that's got a military base in it, like for instance, Norfolk, Virginia, okay, is, its economic base industry is government, but it's military government. That's the real key there. As a matter of fact, Denver, Colorado is not only the state capital, but it's got a Federal Reserve Bank there. It's got a mint, et cetera. So government is actually one of the many economic base industries that drives Denver's growth today. Back in 1979, oil and gas was one of the big drivers. And when we had the oil and gas pullback in 79, Denver, Houston, Dallas got hit together because of the slowdown and loss of jobs from that. But like I say, most cities are trying hard to diversify their economic bases. And of course, every city has its Economic Growth Council and that kind of thing, trying to attract what they call these days clean industries.
Brian, can this type of analysis be utilized overseas? So,
oh
for
yeah,
example, Jishnu is in the Dubai area, right? So, can you
right.
use this type of data accumulation to come up with,
Right. As long as a country's government is collecting employment data and breaking it down, for instance, in the European countries, we can do this. And you can kind of figure out when you go to any city, kind of what's driving, what might be driving that city. Look at the big companies that are there, et cetera. In Germany, we obviously have a lot of manufacturing. It's the largest manufacturing country outside of China and the United States that's there, even though it's a small country in terms of geographic size and population. So yes, you can do that. England, obviously, London, the financial service center of the world, et cetera. Okay. So, and here I show you that this is just an old study that I did a while ago. The employment growth from the United States and the amount of occupied square feet, you see them moving along together, right? And when we have an economic slowdown in employment, you see that occupancy levels like an office drop off together back in 2001 and 2002. And the one property type that has been growing at a faster rate that really started to widen out since the year 2000 is industrial. And that actually comes from two key things. Number one, the one that you would probably all guess right off the top of the bat is the Amazon effect, or the fact that we're now buying more things over the internet, and hence we need storage space to put that stuff in before sending it, because it used to be sitting in the back of a retail store. Now it's got to be sitting in a warehouse before it gets shipped to you. But the other one that's kind of interesting is just the fact that we have more stuff. Okay. And by that, I mean, we have more options of things that we want to buy. When I was a kid, my choices were Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola. Those are the only two colas on the market. Okay. And so in the store, it was, one shelf for Coke and one shelf for Pepsi. And typically only in one, maybe two sizes. Now, I grew up with Coca-Cola. There's Coke, Diet Coke, Lemon Coke, Lime Coke, Vanilla Coke, Coke Zero, Coke this, Coke that. All of a sudden, I need a lot more space to store all those different options, hence the rise there. We also saw a lot of rise in retail square footage because of that. Grocery stores used to be about 30,000 square feet. Now they're 100,000 square feet. I think when I was a kid, there was one potato chip. Now there's an entire aisle of potato chips to choose from. So more space with more options, has become the thing. The number of SKUs, shopkeeping units, the barcode that they scan when you check out, used to be like 5,000 in a grocery store. Now it's 30,000. So we need more space, and industrial has been the one that's really taken off over the past 20 years. Okay, next slide. And so, yes,
I just had a question. Could you? Sure. I know this, since I'm in the GCC, it's a little bit of a difficult question for you to answer. But so since we are an economy that's kind of dependent on oil, and with the recent prices and the pandemic and everything, the oil is going down. So the population of the expatriate workers has actually been falling to kind of help the local population increase its employment. I just wanted to understand the relationship between an increase in an employment rate and the population, because over here the population is falling. So I just trying to understand and ascertain how the relationship really works in order to justify or to understand how it'll affect the real estate market.
Yeah, good question. So in countries where there's been a lot of growth and demand for growth, many times what happens is you end up having immigration to handle jobs. And that has happened in many countries around the world, including the United States. Part of our growth, comes from immigration, both legal and non-legal. If a country is producing something where it needs more people, et cetera, its wages have to go up to attract those people in from other countries. So when you have a declining population, the employment's got to be imported, if you will, to keep things going. So it is a challenge in many countries to kind of figure out what's going on. You've got in Africa, as an example, you've got populations expanding but no employment too. So you've got a real poverty problem from that standpoint. I know that, in my years of working with institutions and doing a lot of work with international investors, many times, we'd be selling, like at Prudential, we'd be selling a building to somebody from an oil country, say, so what's your time frame? How long do you expect to hold this investment? And they go, we expect to hold it forever, because as we, as oil runs out, we need to have investments that produce income for our people, going forward. So I'm not an economist, actually, so I can't really give you the total detail on how those things work, but I know that it's a challenge for you, and I understand where you're coming from that standpoint. So,
right, thank you for that. I just wanted. So for any growth rate, you kind of have to have a base of the previous year. Now over here with the expat population falling, that means your population is declining, just to kind of compensate for the local jobs. So when you put that in context of the employment rate, that would basically mean the employment rate is falling as well, because it depends on what your denominator is of, are you taking the entire population, or I'm just trying to understand the relationship. So if the population is falling, automatically the employment rate has to fall, even though it's just getting compensated.
Correct. Right. Because you got less people to choose from for that employment. Right. And so you either start outsourcing things or your businesses start to wind down.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that. Thank you.
Yep. Okay. DJ, you just jumped forward a whole bunch of slides. Go back to there we go. So, just a kind of quick history here. You can see that expansion periods are typically fairly long, anywhere from, kind of 7 to 10 years. Recessions typically last only a year, right? The Great Recession was 2, and COVID really was 1. And if you will, it is, GDP kind of leads employment growth typically by, a quarter or two. So, our good news is we've got really strong GDP growth right now, and that should bring employment growth back. There is a shortage, I'm sure, as you drive around any place in the United States today. Pretty much every business, especially every retail business, has signs looking to hire now at rates. They were talking about trying to set the minimum wage in the U.S. to $15, and I see on the side of buses, Target offering $16.25 an hour to go work, at their retail store. I think the future, at least for the next year or two, looks pretty bright and above average in both GDP growth and employment growth. So that's positive for us. And next slide.
Glenn, one quick question. So, this black swan event that we had with COVID, if we had a lot of fundamentals, that were there before COVID, quality of life, cost of living, jobs, etc., shouldn't we see that sort of get back to where it was before? So if all those drivers were there pre-COVID, would we eventually get back to where we were before COVID?
I believe so. And I think that, the optimistic forecast is by the end of 2022, we're back to where we should be. One of the problems right now is we still got government subsidies going out to people who are, staying home. I was in an Uber the other day and the guy said, yeah, the number of drivers is way down because, the government subsidy package was, you used to have to work your buns off to make $2,000 a month, to net $2,000 a month. And now they can sit at home with their car parked and, get paid $2,000 a month from the government. So until that goes away, we've got a higher unemployment rate and a demand for a job that's not being met. Okay, so U.S. commercial real estate cycles. The economy. I believe real estate follows the economy, and the three key metrics to look at are occupancy levels, which is just the inverse of vacancy. So more people rent space, occupancy goes up. And when occupancies move, rents move up. And if I get an increase in occupancy and an increase in rent, the income on my property goes up. And that's half of my total return equation. The other half is property prices that give us total return. And I'll talk about that second. That's the financial cycle in real estate. So next slide. So the physical cycle is basically looking at demand and supply for space that drives occupancy. Occupancy drives rent growth, and occupancy plus rent growth drives the income growth in your properties. And we're going to focus on that because that's really the key that will help us to understand, our total return as we move forward. So back in 90, I developed this chart that shows the four quadrants of a cycle: a recovery, expansion, a hyper supply, and a recession phase. So kind of like the economy. And you notice that there are basically 11 points on the way up, hence the long expansionary periods, and 6 on the way down. So long-term real estate cycles have been about 17 years or through 2 economic cycles. If you will, if everything worked perfectly and symmetrically in history, you kind of march through these 1 year at a time. Sometimes we have shorter or longer cycles, but 16, 17 points for that number of years. So let's flip to the next slide. And you'll see that based on where we are in the cycle, we should have a good idea of where rents are going to go. So at the bottom, when you've got low occupancy, high vacancy, points 1 and 2, you got too much of a product and you're going to have negative rent growth. Okay. You're going to drop your price to get the space occupied. As we come through the second half of that recovery, we're getting rent growth at a rate that's below inflation. When we get to the long-term average there, the dotted line that goes through points 6 and 14, we now get rent growth that should be at about the rate of inflation. After that, demand is typically growing because the economy is expanding and construction starting in and trying to keep up, if you will. And we get to point 8, which I have as a green dot, which is the point at which we get to cost feasible new rents. And by that, I mean, if it cost $400 a square foot to build a building and investors are looking for a 10% rate of return on this new development, we're going to get we need rents of $40 or 10% of 400 to cost justify that new building. After that, we start new construction, but like in office downtown, it takes 5 years to put up a building. Apartments, garden level might go up in a year, industrial 9 months, retail, depending upon what it is, 9 months to 2 years, et cetera. So supply is trying to catch up with demand. When supply and demand are growing at the exact same rate, or your old Econ 101 class calls that equilibrium, you get demand and supply growing at the same rate. We're there at the peak at 0.11. We got a high occupancy rate, and if we're lucky, it stays that way for a long time. After that, one of two things is going to happen. Either you're going to get a oversupply by building too much, which we had in the 1980s in office, or you get an economic downturn like the tech bubble bursting back in 2001 and 2, or COVID hitting, and all of a sudden employment drops off and therefore demand drops off. So rent growth, because you got a tight market, starts to slow down or decline and decelerate. go back through the long-term average to low and negative rent growth as we get into that fourth phase of the recession. Next slide. So I did a study that I published, and this is one of the things I'm well known for, is, what happens. So looking at the 54 largest markets in the United States, I looked at their average rent growth, and at the bottom, at points 1 and 2, negative rent growth, as you would expect. Then it starts turning positive. When we get to 0.6, the long-term average, you can see that rent growth averaged 4%. And over that time frame from 68 to 97, that was about the rate of inflation. So at 0.6, you get inflation. In the growth phase, you're getting way above inflation, with the highest rent growth happening at 0.10 on the cycle. And then as we hit the peak, the growth rate starts to slow a little bit, and then it starts to drop off or decelerate 10, 6, back to 3.3% at 0.14 on the cycle, and then low and negative again at the bottom. Next slide, same study. There you go. For industrial, basically same kind of thing. Negative, low rents at the bottom, a little better than inflation at 0.6, highest rent growth at 0.10, and then deceleration and down to low and negative at the bottom. So if you knew where your city was in the cycle, would that not help you in making investment decisions to acquire, to improve a property, to sell it now, to sign longer leases or shorter leases in everything that you're doing? So your investment strategies, your management strategies can come from this kind of thing. Next slide.
So Glenn, let me ask you a question. Let's say that in your market, you're seeing these annual rates where it goes from 4.6 to 5.1, back down, then back up to 6.8. Can you use that and tie it in with where you probably are based upon, so we're up to 6.8 growth, then 8.5, now we came down a little bit.
Right.
I think we're near the top.
So that's the growth in the publicly available information is the asking rents. So asking rents are going to be higher or lower. In most commercial real estate, when you sign a lease, it's got in it escalation clause. So every year rents go up by the rate of inflation or a set step of, let's say, 2% or whatever the case may be. But when that lease ends, signing the next lease, sometimes you got a property where leases are below, market rate. So you're going to get a nice jump. But each year they just look at the asking rent, asking rent's 40. And next year it's 44. That's a 10% increase in the asking rent. Every lease that's signed is a negotiation between the landlord and the tenant. And that's normally kept very private because a landlord doesn't want a tenant on floor 2 who signed a lease for $40 a square foot to know that the tenant on floor 3, they signed for 38. So they don't publish the actual numbers from that standpoint. Okay, so every quarter I put out a market cycle report, and what I do is I look at the major property types across the country and where the national average is. So end of first quarter 2021, you can see suburban office in the middle of the growth phase. A main reason for that is we saw a lot of companies decide to move out of downtowns out to the suburbs to gain more space for same or lower rents. And hence there was some good demand growth. Industrial warehouse obviously at a peak because of the Amazon effect. In the hypersupply phase, pretty much every other property type, but retail, malls, and power centers, at their lowest cyclical occupancy rate. Next slide. So, but the key is that as you go out to decide where to go, and this was really, came from my work at Prudential, where they said, tell us, we've got all these different cities to choose from. Where should we be going and where should we be looking to buy properties right now? What cities should we be focusing our efforts on? So here are the 54 largest cities in the country and where they are currently in the cycle. You see some of them in the growth phase. So their occupancies have been going up and are expected to go up. majority of them in the hyper supply phase where their occupancies are coming down. And after each city, in some cases, you see numbers, a plus or a minus, and that just tells you where it's moved from the previous quarter. So at point 12, you see Cincinnati at the top with +5, which means Cincinnati was at 0.7, just coming into the growth phase the previous quarter. And now, based on the forecast for what's going to happen to it, it looks like its occupancies are going to be starting to head down. The worst market here you see as Houston down in the recession phase, because over the past 3 years, we've had low gas prices, and hence the oil industry has been laying people off. So the dominant economic based industry in Houston has been declining, and that hasn't pushed, we don't need additional lawyers to help them. We don't need, additional things going on from that standpoint. And I have put in red here, Denver, which you see at 0.6, mainly because I just want to follow it through the different property types, because demand and supply is different for each property type. So Denver was moving into the growth phase at 0.7. We are in the process of finishing a number of new office buildings in Denver right now that are driving the occupancy rate backwards. But Denver is a city that has really good growth prospects. It's one of those second tier cities that is a little bit more affordable and people want to move to. Austin, Texas has been #1 for the past 2 years. So Denver has come backwards in its occupancy level to its long-term average, but the forecast still shows it moving forward. Oh, and by the way, one of the things that you don't hear in the news much about is that we actually have a large amount of new office supply coming online this year in 2021 in downtowns across the country, mainly because it takes about 5 years to go through it. So back in 2016, the future looked bright, and people started, and there was a lot of demand from millennials wanting to both live and work downtown, that we started a lot of new office space that finishes itself out this year. So we're in the hyper supply phase for a lot of these cities because of this oversupply that is coming along. So Denver at 0.6. Go ahead.
Yeah. So when you look at the hyper supply, and Cincinnati was an example you gave, that's taken into consideration what's coming online, correct?
That is right. That is correct. Okay. So next slide, let's move to industrial. You see, as you would expect, the major number of cities at their peak equilibrium because demand is good. The cities in the hyper supply phase, a lot of that is because of the not bulk warehouse, which is in huge demand. And even though we're building a fair amount of it, it's not being oversupplied. But the R&D flex space, the smaller people, users, and sometimes that's even retail in the hyper supply phase. Quick little story about Denver. Denver got a new economic base industry 6 years ago when we legalized marijuana. And all of a sudden, all of the old crappy warehouse out there got leased up for growing pot. And our rents went from $3 a square foot to $6 a square foot. And today it's now $10 a square foot. Well, as more and more cities or more and more states legalize marijuana, the tourism that we used to be getting driving the demand growth in this industry has dropped off. And we've actually had a couple of marijuana producers actually go out of business. And so all of a sudden the demand for warehouse, and we started building new warehouse as well for these marijuana people. And we literally oversupplied the marketplace. So in the case of Denver, it's in the hyper supply phase due to some oversupply and a slight decline in demand. Okay, so next slide. And here you see Denver's apartment market at peak occupancy. Half the market's in hyper supply. Because apartments are easy to finance because of the government agencies being able to give you the permanent mortgage, you see that we are oversupplying in a lot of cases. But now with housing prices having gone through the roof, I think this may change, and a lot of these cities will move back into the expansion phase. Denver did, just because of the large number of people moving into Denver, from California. Like, I believe it's like 1,000 people a week are turning in their California driver's license for a Colorado driver's license. And the two worst cities, San Francisco and San Jose, two of the absolute highest cost housing markets in the country, people moving out and to other places. 2 years ago, I was on a chairlift skiing, and the lady next to me said, "Oh yeah, I just moved here from San Francisco. Charles Schwab just moved our back office operations from San Francisco to Denver. Now I can afford twice as much space for an apartment, and I'm actually looking at the fact that I can afford to buy a house." So moving into second-tier cities with lower cost of living has been a trend that COVID literally just accelerated. Okay, next slide. And retail, again, this is probably the most surprising thing to see, is that a lot of the markets are at their peak. And I said, wait a minute, you have all these, stores that shut down because of COVID. And they said, yeah, but they didn't vacate the store and get rid of their lease. They may have gotten some free rent or, a cessation in paying rent for a little while, but it's not back on the market. So the occupancy level hasn't dropped. And you see Denver here just over the peak in the hyper supply phase from that standpoint. Okay, so next slide. So one of the things I want to do is make you students of economic shifts and things that go on. So let's go back over the last 4 decades and see what's happened. Here's the demand and supply for office. In the early 70s, you had a demand for office, the yellowish white bar there running at around 2%, where supply was running at an average rate of around 5%. And we had public mortgage REITs who were financing a lot of that office construction. We had a recession in 74 that really dropped the demand for office. And then in the second half of the 70s, the baby boom generation, and that was me, got our first jobs, and data became an important thing. But we literally only had mainframe computers. And I learned how to program in college and actually did a lot of programming on computers on a mainframe at United Bank of Denver when I was there. And we see a major increase in demand, almost to 6% in 1978 for space, and supply, not quite catching up. Go to the next slide. In the 1980s, we saw supply averaging 7.7% a year over that entire decade. And 2 fun factoids about that. Number one, if you took and did compound growth on all those years of growth, we doubled the amount of office space in the United States in 1 decade. And 80% of that new construction was in the suburbs. So we literally created the suburban office markets around the US in the 1980s because people were tired of commuting to downtown, which is pretty incredible. But actually, the real incredible thing on this graph is the employment growth. The employment growth averaged 3.8%, which is about half of the new supply. So we had a whole decade of oversupply and a decline in occupancies. But the average employment growth in the United States was 1.5%. How is it possible that office demand grew at a rate of 3.8? And the answer is that the United States itself went through an economic-based shift. We used to be a manufacturing country. In 1960, 30% of all jobs were in manufacturing in the United States. Today, it's 9%. In 1960, about 8% of all jobs were in office-using jobs, and today it's over 30%. So that shift from manufacturing to office-using type jobs, technology, et cetera, was a major economic shift that happened during that decade. Next slide. And then in the 90s, you see that we literally shut down new construction because of all the overbuilding that we did, and we had a lot of foreclosures and that kind of thing, and no bank would finance a new office building. So office supply, the black bar, went to almost nothing in the mid 90s and then picked back up to only 2.5% in 1999, whereas we absorbed a lot of that oversupply with 1.5 to 2% demand growth throughout that decade. And very nicely in 1998 and 1999, we got demand and supply matching up. So we sat at a peak occupancy level or equilibrium level during that decade. Next slide. So the 2000s come along. We have the technology bubble burst, and first time ever negative demand for office space in 2001. It comes back to a nice peak over 2% in 2005, goes back to a negative in 2009. And if you look at supply, you can see how it's kind of lagging demand, high, when demand drops off, slowing down to 2004 and then starting to pick back up. So lagging it by a couple of years. And on to the next slide. And our most recent decade, fortunately, more demand than supply up until 2019 and 2020. And so, we're getting this technology disruption and change in how office demand is going to be used that we're not quite sure of yet. So next slide. And if we look at supply today, with demand, with the economy growing at 2% there, the black line, you can see supply literally since the early 90s has been kind of bouncing around with the economic cycles, but is well below the 2% demand growth, which is good news. It means that we get back to better fundamentals here in all the property types. You can see how apartments, was over that with oversupply and, kind of ends after 2020 and then starts to drop off. Okay, next slide. So here's the historic cycle, which my graph, is trying to emulate. High occupancy back in 1980, low in 95, in 85 through 1991. With that recession, bouncing back up to a peak near 2000 with the technology bubble that burst. We dropped to a bottom in 2003. We come back to a low average in 2005-06, bottom out during the Great Recession, come back up to what looks like a nice kind of equilibrium running from about 2016 to 2020, maybe even 2021, and then starting to fall off, mainly because we think that office use, changes with what's happening with technology. And you can see how the rent growth has followed that cycle. The correlation between occupancies and rent growth is almost 80%. And rents have risen since we started collecting this data in 86 by over 50%. So, forecast is for a slowing growth. Today, we're running right about the rate of inflation. And with that dropping off as occupancies decline from 91 to kind of 90%. Next slide.
So Glenn, how come, you look at occupancy went way down in the 2001 to 2008, but yet growth went up, right?
Yep.
Between that one period of time.
Well, we had an occupancy increase between 2002 and 2006. And so we had rent growth then running in the neighborhood of 6% at that time. And that's asking rents, and that's on newer buildings too, in many cases. Okay. So, next slide. So my forecast is that pretty much every city in the hypersupply phase and the cities where we have all this overbuilding coming online this year and next year are in the recession phase, points 15 and 16. And so you see a lot of the larger cities. And oh, by the way, one of the things I forgot to mention, you notice that I've got some of these cities that are in bold and italics, like at point 15, Dallas, Houston, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C. Out of 54 cities, it only takes 11 office markets to make up 50% of all the square feet listed, in these cities. So we have major concentrations of office, and that happens in each market. Okay, so like when we get to hotel, if we had hotels, Las Vegas would be the largest hotel market, but it changes, with each property type. Okay. And we're seeing, the move out of higher cost cities into lower cost cities. Hence you see, Houston, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, San Jose, in that recession phase. Austin is there mainly because of the overbuilding that's happening, not because demand growth isn't good. Okay, next slide.
Glenn, sorry.
Yes.
I have a quick question. What's the +1, -1 next to some of the cities?
Okay, that's the movement of the cities. So for instance, Dallas Fort Worth was at position 14, and now it's moved forward to position 15. So instead of having to go back to a previous report, you can say, oh, okay, Dallas was at 14 and it moved forward to 15. Okay. Or like up at point 12, Indianapolis has a -1. Its occupancy was a little lower and it actually improved a little bit. Or Tampa at the peak was in the hyper supply phase, and now it looks like it's tightening up because of we got a lot of baby boomers moving, and hence business and office use, especially for attorneys, medical office, accountants, et cetera, that service those people, renting space. Great question. Thank you, Bridget. Next slide. So industrial looks like the same kind of cycle. It looks like occupancy is coming down mainly from new construction, as well as that R&D flex space not getting leased up. But even though occupancies have been coming down for the last 2 years, we get a spike in rents because all the new construction is, because of the cost of new construction going up, they're asking for more rent to justify building those buildings as we go on. Next slide. And again, a lot of markets still at peak and many markets in the hyper supply phase. So be careful where you decide to invest in industrial. Next slide. And apartments, again, we had peak occupancies in both 2004 and again in 2018 and 19. With the pandemic, we've seen things slow down as far as demand growth. And we think that continues in 2021 and into 2022. And then it bounces right back as people get their jobs and come back in. We've already just seen this last month. The new reports are telling us that there is a little bit of a demand growth back into the cities. People are coming back now that cities are opening up and there's rents and there's restaurants and entertainment opening back up. Next slide. So again, majority of the cities in the hyper supply phase here. Worst city in the country is now San Francisco because of its high cost and people moving out. Next slide. And retail, the big surprise even before COVID was that we were at the highest occupancy level ever seen in retail. Part of that story is the fact that a lot of retail was being taken out and changed uses from retail to apartments, retail to office space, and with last mile distribution retail into industrial. So we've not seen a lot of growth in new supply. But we see that again trailing off, I think, over the next few years. Next slide. And again, majority of the cities in the hyper supply phase. So picking, the right city to invest in, quite important here. And next slide. So last on the agenda for today, and we got 10 minutes left, is the financial cycle. And to me, it is capital flows that drive the prices of real estate. Next slide. And so, real estate is an asset class that is vying for investors' money against stocks, bonds, commodities, private equity. And the question is whether domestic or global too. And continue on to the next slide. And the capital flow cycle in black here, you see it's at a low flat number at the bottom. It picks up, goes to its highest rate of growth as it goes through that cost feasible rent level at 0.8, peaks out in the hyper supply and drops off quickly. But we have two types of capital flowing to real estate. One is the green shaded area of capital flowing to existing property. So if you buy a property from me for a higher price than I paid, that's more capital coming into real estate. And then at the bottom, capital flow to new construction should start about at the cost feasible level. But if I start a property, building a new property near the peak, I don't finish it till near the bottom. That's still more capital coming in to real estate. Next slide. And so when we look at it today, of the three majors here, the stock market at 26 trillion is 30% of the investable universe. The bond market, 38 trillion, is 47%. And US income producing real estate is about 22% of the investable universe. If we look at the institution, pension funds, currently today, their average is about 10% invested in real estate. Most of them have a target allocation that they haven't met. That's now running around 12.5 or 13. The endowments of the world are running at about 15%, with, again, a target allocation of 20. Next slide.
One thing too I want to mention, Glenn, is family offices, the average to real estate is 22%.
Great. Correct. So you're right at you family offices are correctly allocated based on size to real estate in their portfolios. Okay. So why does real estate look good today? Well, here's the history of 10-year treasuries over the last 70 years. And obviously interest rates have gone up to a peak of 15% in 81 and down to a low last year. The average yield on the 10-year treasury has been 5.7. But the total return, and one of the problems I get, especially with young analysts, is well, over the past 10 years, bonds have averaged an 8.77% return. Yeah, that's because interest rates have been coming down. When an interest rate goes down, a bond value goes up. So the $1,000 bond you bought at 6% many years ago, if you can sell it for 3%, that means you're going to sell it for $2,000 to yield that person 3%. Today, we're looking at rising interest rates. So go back to 1953, and between 53 and 73, when it hit the long-term average, the total return was only 1.9. And from 53 to the peak in 81, even though the yield was 5.7 average, the total return was only 3.9. So you're guaranteed to lose principal if you buy a bond today and interest rates go up. So next slide. When we look at the up and down years of real estate, what we see is real estate has had 78 years of positive returns and only 5 years of negative, versus the stock and bond market with both right around 20 years of negative returns. Next slide. And so it is truly capital flow, the number of people buying properties, that really makes the difference. And a company called Real Capital Analytics that started in 2000, a friend of mine, Bob White, started collecting data on every commercial real estate transaction over $2.5 million. 20 trillion in the first quarter of 01, peaking at 162 trillion in 07, bottoming at 15 trillion in 09, and peaking over 160 starting in 2015 and continuing even in the third quarter here of 2020. And so they produce the real commercial property price index, or CPPI, and you see that it follows the capital flows very closely. And on the next side, we can break that down by property type.
So Glenn, when there's a decrease going into 2021, I guess that's the effect of COVID, I assume.
Right. That decline into in 2019 into 2020, where you see it just flatten out. The volume slowed down, and so pricing didn't continue to rise. Exactly. Okay. They've got all the individual transactions, so broken down by property type. If we look at where prices are today versus the peak in 2007, on average, we're 40% higher than we were in 07. Apartments are 95% higher. Retail hasn't quite gotten all the way back yet. Industrial is 42% higher. CBD, or central business district office, is 37% higher, and suburban office only 7% higher. So we can kind of judge, how things are going from that standpoint. If we go to the next slide, using cap rates, which is, again, the cash on cash return, the unleveraged return when you buy a property. Cap rates used to be, 8 to 9% back in 01. They came down to the 7% range average in 07, and then went back up when things slowed down during the Great Recession. Nope, stay at that slide there, DJ, if you can. 2 more. There we go. And today, apartments are down to 5. The other major commercials are in the 6.5 to 7, and hotels, because of their risk, at 8.5. And you go, wow, real estate's expensive today on a historic basis. And that is correct, except that we have to take it on a relative basis. And so on the next slide, what we do is we look at the spread over the risk-free rate of a 10-year treasury. So today I can buy a 10-year treasury at 1.6. I can buy into the stock market, the S&P 500, with a 1.1% dividend yield. Or I can buy into real estate, and what am I getting? Well, back in 01, you got about 4% average over the 10-year treasury in yield. It dropped to only about 2 in 07, but today it's between 4 and 7%. So on a relative basis, because I can't go backwards and buy in history, real estate on a relative basis is a very attractive investment, a higher yielding investment, which is what most people are looking for. So that's one of the reasons that I think it's still attractive. And then we've really gone through a major change where real estate has gone from being local buyer, local seller, local bank doing the financing in the 70s to national buyer, national seller, national bank financing available in the 80s because of the institutions, the pension funds and endowments coming in. In the 1990s, real estate got its first access to the public capital markets with publicly traded REITs and with commercial mortgage-backed securities for debt. And since 2000, real estate's literally gone global. So if we look at, this is now Real Capital Analytics collecting data from around the world, and the lines show the capital flowing across country lines. So in 2020, the United States invested $11.8 billion into Germany, a 27% increase over the previous year. If you go to number 4, Germany into the United States was $5.6 billion, a 1% decline from the previous year. And so you see money moving around the world. And the interesting thing is that, the top property pre-COVID to sell was an office building in New York City at a 4 cap rate. That same Class A office building in downtown London would have sold or transacted for a 2% cap rate. And in Asia, in either Hong Kong or Tokyo, a Class A office building would transact at a 1% cap rate. So to a global investor, a European investor says, wow, US real estate's 50% less expensive. I can get double the yield that I can get here in Europe. So I'm going to buy some US. And an Asian investor goes, wow, it's a 75% off deal in the United States. I'll buy there. So every transaction will probably see 20 bidders, half of them being international buyers, just for that reason relative to, their cost of capital. So where are we in the cycle today? Here are, and this comes off of NAREIT's website, here are the 17-year cycles, the 72 to 89 cycle. We saw a yearly average increase of 13%, then 89 to 07 cycle. We see a 14% average yearly return. And in this cycle, we had the real negative of the Great Recession. And I'm sorry, this doesn't show the COVID change yet. But so far in, up to COVID, it was only a 3.9% return. So, a lower yielding environment has led to a lower total return environment for real estate too. Next slide. So that is my presentation, and we are right on 1 o'clock. We'll leave it open here for questions for a minute. Otherwise, we'll go on lunch break and come back in an hour for Peter Linneman to do his presentation on finance and investments.
So any questions from anyone? Great. Well, we'll be getting, you should already have the email in order to go into the next session in about an hour. I believe you'll get another email shortly that'll give you that to log back in. And if you have any additional questions that come up, feel free to email Glenn at glenn.miller at 4.institute, and we'll see you in about an hour.
Thank you very much,
Great.
Glenn.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks very much.
See you in an hour.